Hi, I'm Stephanie Jaworski of joybaking.com. Today we're going to make an apple crisp, and this is what it looks like. This dessert has two layers. On the bottom we have chunks of lightly sweetened apples. We're going to cover that with a streusel-like topping that is nice and crisp, and it contains some rolled oats, some chopped nuts, and a little bit of cinnamon. So the first thing that you will need to do is to preheat your oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 190 degrees Celsius. And you will need an 8-inch square baking pan, that's 20 centimeters. Now, you could, if you don't have an 8-inch square, you could use a 9-inch round, which 23 centimeter, like a deep dish pie pan, that would do just as well. And you can either spray your pan with one of those nonstick cooking sprays, but I'm going to brush mine with some melted butter. I just melted, maybe a tablespoon of butter, and then use a pastry brush. And make sure it's all buttered. Okay. So now, two parts to an apple crisp. Like I said, you have the fruit, and then you have the topping. I'm going to start with the topping. I actually just make it by hand. Sometimes you could, if you want, you could use a food processor. That's really a fast way of doing it, but we'll do it by hand today. So first, you will need a half a cup, 65 grams of all-purpose flour, plain flour. We're going to sweeten that with a quarter cup, 50 grams of granulated white sugar, and a quarter of a cup, 55 grams of light brown sugar. If you're using like a cup measurement, make sure you kind of pat the brown sugar down into the measuring cup to get rid of any air pockets. And then, I don't know, apple crisp just has to have ground cinnamon, at least to me. You could leave it out if you don't like cinnamon, but I do. So a half a teaspoon of ground cinnamon, and I'm just going to use just a pinch of salt, like 1/8 of a teaspoon. So I'm just whisking this. You can just put your hands right in there. And I forgot my butter. It's still in the fridge. So I'm going to have to take a little break here, and I'll be right back with my butter. Okay, I'm back with my butter. And you want it cold, so that's why it was in the fridge. You will need 6 tablespoons, 85 grams. I'm using unsalted butter here. You could use salted. I just prefer to regulate the salt in my recipes. That's why I use unsalted, plus I like the flavor. If you use salted butter, I would just leave out, we put a pinch of salt in, just leave that out. So you want to, like I said, cold butter. I've cut mine into chunks because we're going to cut the butter into our dry ingredients, and if I just had a big block of butter, it would take a little longer to cut it in. If you are using a food processor, put your dry ingredients in there, process it, and then add your chunks of butter, process until we just want, it looks like coarse crumbs, so the butter's in small pieces. I love using a pastry blender. That's what I always use. You could just use your fingertips. That's just as good if you don't have one of these pastry blenders. So just cut the butter, press down until this whole thing looks like coarse crumbs. Okay, that looks good. Scrape my pastry blender off here. So this is what you're looking for, just kind of coarse crumbs. You'll see a little chunks of butter. That's perfectly fine. So now what we're going to do is add 1/3 of a cup, 30 grams of rolled oats. Now my personal favorite is to use the old-fashioned rolled oats. You have old-fashioned and you have quick cooking. The difference is in the thickness of the oats. And I like the old-fashioned because they're thicker, and it gives you a little more texture to our topping. But you could use, if all you had in the house was quick cooking, just use those. And then, my favorite, half a cup, 50 grams of chopped nuts. My personal favorite is today I'm using coarsely chopped pecans. You could use walnuts. You could use hazelnuts. You could use almonds. I mean, so there's a variety of one. Now, I did toast my pecans because I find it brings out their caramel flavor. So you just put them on a baking sheet, put them in the oven, maybe 5 minutes, and then just let them cool, and then coarsely chop them. I like pretty big chunks because then you get, when you're eating your apple crisp, you get these chunks of apple, or of nuts, I should say. And you may ask, there's apple crisp and there's apple crumble. The difference between the two mainly is this: in a crumble, you don't tend to add the rolled oats and the nuts, but other than that, they're kind of similar desserts. So that is our topping. Now, I'm going to move right on to my apples. If you wanted to do this ahead of time, you could. You could do this to this point. You could cover it and put it into the fridge for a day or two, really. And then you could, you know, when you want to make the dessert, just pull it out of the fridge. But we're going to carry on. I'm just going to clean up here, set up, and we'll be right back to do the apples. So now for our apples, you will need 6 cups, which is 750 grams of apples that have been peeled, cored, and cut into 1 inch, 2.5 centimeter chunks, like this. So for that amount, 6 cups, 750 grams, you will need to start with about 2.5 pounds of apples, or 1.1 kilograms. So you want to use a firm textured apple, which means, and we do that because when it bakes, we don't want the apples to turn into mush. We want them to keep their shape. So firm textured apples. Examples, year-round favorites are like the Granny Smith, you have the Golden Delicious, you have the Gala, you have the Honeycrisp, Braeburn, John o' Gold. That's some of the ones you can usually find in your grocery store. I do encourage you to go to your local apple orchard or a farmer's market. They have lots of like smaller varieties that we normally can't buy. And the added bonus, they taste good, and we are supporting our farmers. So take your apple. I peeled it using my peeler. And then I cut it in half. You see that? And then I just cut down on either side of the core and across the bottom. And you know, when I peel my apples, if I wash them first, and if there's a little bit of skin, I like a little bit of skin. So, you know, you may want more or less. And then once you get it, you cut it into about 1 inch chunks, 2.5 centimeters. If you're like me, sometimes what is 1 inch? I usually get my ruler out to start, and then I measure one, you know, and then I can go from there. So, and just if you want, you could add a little bit of, sometimes I add like a handful of blackberries. Excellent. Apples, blackberries. Raspberries I like too. So just to, and also, you could use one type of apple, like say a Granny Smith, but what I really like to do is to use at least 2. Today I'm using 3 varieties, and that really gives your apple crisp like I think a much better flavor. You get all different types of apples. So I'm just going to put that right in there. Don't forget that. And then I'm just going to put some freshly squeezed lemon juice, about a half a lemon, if you want to get, you know, technical, I guess it's about a tablespoon. And what that does is, when we toss that, it prevents your apples from turning brown. I mean, a little brown's okay, but if they're going, especially if you're going to let this sit for any length of time, you do want to put some lemon juice on there. Now, taste your apples, because every variety, you know, I tend to lean towards the more tart flavored for my apple crisp. So I'm going to use, maybe not quite because I tasted them not that sharp. So I'm going to say 3 tablespoons, 40 grams of granulated white sugar. if you're using a sweeter variety, you can cut way back on that sugar. Really, you don't, because the topping's quite sweet. So, you know, as much or as little as you want. I'm actually not going to add it all because, well, the Granny Smiths are a little tart. I used the Gala, which isn't as, mine aren't as tart. So, okay. And that's it. Let's get my, we're just going to dump that right in there. So if you, I mean, really, when you're doing this, you don't really even have to measure. You can use your pan as a way to measure how many, just scrape out all, if there's any sugar, just scrape it out. You could use your pan as a guide to how much apples will fit in there. So that you want about 3/4, maybe a little more, and that's about what you need. And then, well, the topping. Just spread that evenly on the top. I love this dessert, especially in the fall. I mean, kind of getting chilly outside and the smell of apples, cinnamon. This is, I mean, it's really good. Warm from the oven. You can let it cool to room temperature. And, you know, I do like it cold. And ice cream, vanilla ice cream, whipped cream. Yum, yum. Okay, so just kind of get that. So there we go. Baking time. I'm going to say 30, 35. It depends, too, on what type of pan you're using. So that can kind of affect your baking time. But I'm going to say 30 to 35. And what you're looking for, it'll turn golden brown on top. You'll start to see it bubble. And if you take a knife and insert it into one of the some of the chunks of apple, it'll be like, you don't want it hard and you don't want it mushy. It'll just be nice and tender. So I would check it, you know, in around that 30 minutes. Just to make sure, you know, you don't want to overdo it and then they get mushy. So 30 to 35 minutes. So our apple crisp is done. See, nice browning. I don't know whether you can see it, but it's just starting to bubble around the edges. And I did insert a knife into one of the apple chunks, make sure it's tender. So put your pan on a wire rack, obviously a little too hot for us to try yet. I'm just going to let it cool down, and then when we come back, we'll try it. So our apple crisp cooled down, but it's still a little warm. To serve it, you could serve it like a plated dessert, but my favorite way is just a bowl. I don't know, there's something kind of homey about this dessert, and I just think in a bowl is perfect. If it is kind of hot, which it is now, my favorite way is with a little vanilla ice cream on top, because then that kind of melts and it just makes a little sauce. There is a little juice here on the bottom, so I like to just, you know, put that over the top. And if I serve it at room temperature, sometimes still with vanilla ice cream, or whipped cream is good. Oh, you know, there is a long line of this type of fruit-based dessert. They're called homey, old-fashioned, that kind of combination of baked fruit with the topping. I don't know whether it's my Canadian roots, but the apple crisp is just my favorite. You have the lightly sweetened chunks of apple. You know, they're tender, they're not mushy. And then you have that topping. I like the crunch of the nuts, and then you get a little chew from the rolled oats, and then of course you've got the sweetness, and it does get crisp. hence the name, Apple Crisp, which is really good. Now, like I said, serve it like kind of quite hot. You can do it room temperature. I always cover my leftovers, put it into the refrigerator. Sometimes I just eat it cold from the fridge, or you could pop it into the microwave and just warm it up a little. So if it's fall or winter, or you just feel like a really nice old-fashioned homey dessert, try this Apple Crisp. And until next time, I'm Stephanie Jaworski of joybaking.com.